I'm on week 6 of a round-the-world tour. This is my 7th country. I am not a researcher. I'm not a theorist. I have been building practical systems for my entire career. I'm about getting stuff built and getting them deployed. This is my 2nd round trip of the world this year, and I'm looking at the next one in a couple months. And the reason you do it is you have to talk to people who are building real systems. You have to listen to what they're saying and what they're not saying, and then you have to synthesize out of it what the real requirements of any system are. This talk is born out of love for this community. I think we've got some really important work happening here. It's also born out of a desire to have impact. And frankly, there's some urgency, and that may come through. I'm going to talk about 2 wars. We're going to start with something different. 2 weeks ago, I'm in a room with a bunch of Ukrainian engineers, and it brings it home. Right? They're all women. They're worried. They are innovating at speed. This is the war of one-day ideas. This is a new kind of war, and it's hot, and it's happening now. The question wasn't how many people are going to die today. It's how many people are going to die during this talk. All right? This war is being conducted in a manner where you come up with an idea for a defense system, a weapon system, whatever. You deploy it for one day, and it's done because the tactics on the battlefield are changing that quickly. Now, that doesn't mean that everything in your systems changes quickly. The rate you can discharge a battery doesn't change. The rate you can charge it doesn't change. The amount of fuel you can jam into an engine doesn't change. But your mission, your tactics, your software are changing at the last minute, and sometimes multiple times per day. I've talked to people in multiple countries, and this has been a wild year. The old way of thinking of defense is you outspend your opponent on hardware. You buy more molecules, meaning more shells, more bullets, more guns, and you have an advantage. That is the old way of thinking. The new way of thinking is software-defined defense, where you build a system and you do not know what its mission is or what it's going to do until the moment you set it off. That's how people are thinking. And the hot war in Europe in particular has absolutely changed the tone of what I'm hearing. It was emotional. It was an interesting trip. There's another war happening, and this one you hear about more as you get farther from Europe. I've heard it referred to as Cold War 2.0. This is a software war. We currently sit in a position where multiple countries and multiple sides have so deeply infiltrated their opponent's infrastructure that when an event kicks off, in about 10 minutes, there'll be no water, no gas, no power, no hospitals, no financial system. And then you just let time, hunger, and thirst take over. That's Cold War 2.0. Think mutually assured destruction. This is the war of single-use weapons. You can only use it once. And once you've used it, it's no longer a viable weapon because your opponents know what it is. In this case, you have to think as a defender, what can I do to prevent against unknown attacks? Things that may happen very, very quickly where there isn't any time for a human to take intervention. You have to have systems that can adjust themselves, take over, and change their defensive posture. Oh, and crazily, trying to do an implementation of a defense is really hard because doing that means working with municipalities. Right? These are the people who actually run the water pumps. These are the people who keep your hospital running, and they need to have their systems updated. And by the way, Microsoft did just put out a report that 30% of these systems are running Windows XP today, and the rest are running systems that are out of support. They're not being patched anymore. Right? The need is desperate. I've also heard a lot of talk about dual use. Right? Dual use used to mean, hey, we're going to build systems and invested systems that can be used in a hot conflict and in consumer products. I've really come to believe dual use means systems that can be used in a hot conflict and in a cold conflict. Specifically, what can we do to protect our infrastructure and to help people who are in a hot situation? Two quick examples of things that I'm thinking about. When I think about a system, we're going to hear lots of talks about really low-level things, capabilities, policies. That's all correct. That all needs to be worried about. I think about systems from a higher level. In this case, on the right-hand side, you've got standard software guard kind of implementation, right? You're sitting in front of a water pump. You got OT people on the other side who are trying to control it. And you got a piece of software in the middle that's trying to filter out bad commands. That's like basic defense against Cold War II style attacks. Through a software diode, which we can implement with policies like what are provided in seL4, you can have software on the left side, which integrates with the OT team. Maybe you've got a data scientist who's pulling data out of it as it's operating, so you can start to build an AI that can detect unknown attacks when they're happening. You can start hooking into a historian. And you start to realize there's some dichotomies that are happening here. I've got one side of this that changes slowly. You know, you don't make up new MQTT packets. You don't change the thing you're trying to protect. But the data scientist is pulling data. They're pushing an update 3 times a day. Right, those data scientists are writing in JavaScript, and they're used to fast turnaround and making things happen. The OT team, they may not change twice a day, but they might change every week. Those are the people who are responsible for running the plant. They have a system to worry about. So you end up with different stakeholders, different players with different time frames and different needs, but still running on the same computer. You go to the next step and you realize factories and other kinds of systems are also fundamentally changing. As I talk to big enterprise companies, I hear a lot about virtual PLCs, which are factory controllers. And by the way, you can see one running in the back. Right, so virtual PLCs are old school tech, I think 40, 50 years old. They work because they're simple. They work because they're physically isolated. But the desire is to virtualize these things and get them running on a blade, on a PC. Well, how do we separate those? You need isolation. You need formal methods behind it. Stuff on the right changes slowly, but it's a more complicated architecture. We need systems that can allow for complicated architectures. On the left, I've got things that change more rapidly. I may have deployed an AI that's using probabilistic decision engines to make decisions about how my factory's running, but that thing's still getting updated every day as the model changes. Right, I've still got different stakeholders. I've still got different types of problems happening at the same time. I've also learned to think in terms of zones. Right, in a zone, I've got a bunch of software on a computer, but you can start to group the applications into collectives. On the right, in this case, I've got some software, let's say this is a car. I've got a bunch of software that A, changes slowly, but B, it can't go down. It's a safety issue if something on the right goes down. You do not want signals from the outside world sent to your CAN bus. The CAN bus controls your brakes. On the left-hand side, I've got things that are connected to the internet. It might be doing mapping. It might be tracking which state you owe road tax to. It might be doing a whole bunch of complicated stuff. The point is that I don't trust it as much. And if there's a fault anywhere on the left, I want to be able to wipe that whole side down. I need to fix the error that happened, and I need to know that I've done it in a way that doesn't cause a safety issue on the right. That's one way to think of it. You could think of it in terms of fast-changing software versus slow-changing software. You can think of it as regulatory regions. What does it mean when I've achieved ISO 26262 certification on the stuff on the right, and then you want to push an update to the software on the left, which is running on the same computer? Do I have to go through a 3-month recertification process, or can I have it work? There's a realization, and this was really pushed by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that government regulation is broken and doesn't scale. Right? If I certify the slow stuff on a computer, and then you push that update to me, and this case is an electrical controller sitting on a new microreactor, they're going to take 3 months to update even the little change, when instead you have 3 hours or you have 3 days. So things have to change, and only by thinking of zones, thinking of isolation in more than just the normal ways, can we get there. So when I think about overall system requirements, I think, okay, what I've heard over and over, systems don't get turned off. There are parts of a system that don't change. There's parts of a system that change rapidly. They both have to be supported. You have to be able to update a device without turning it off. You have to be able to change the configuration of a device, and you don't know in advance what that change is going to be. And in fact, in most cases, your adversary will prevent you from knowing what that configuration needs to be. You don't know your mission, you don't know your design, you don't know the architecture. You do know the engines, you do know the equipment, you do know the slow stuff, but the fast stuff you don't know. When you ask the same people worrying about this stuff, well, okay, if you're in an urgent situation, can you ignore the regulations? And the answer comes back as no. They still have to comply with the regulations. In cars, you still have to worry about 26262. In industrial, you still have to worry about 62443. In aeronautics, you still have to worry about the various DO 178s. They're not going away. But we have to think about isolating that regulatory environment. We have to think about the different stakeholders, and that's hard. The only thing we know is that we have changed into a world of rapid change, where we do not know what things will be in advance. Now, the rest of this is requirements. This slide is it's partly why I'm here, because I love seL4, and partly my request for attention. Right, seL4 won me over because of spatial isolation and verified isolation. That verified isolation is why it gets used at all. And if it's not verified, it's not going to get used. Sorry, that's just reality. What's missing is multi-core support, which, when I talk to people, comes off as seL4 has a perceived performance problem. Performance on a single core is fantastic. It's really fantastic, absolutely top of the line, but when your customer has an 8-core machine and they really need those 8 cores and they pull off their mission, it's perceived as a performance problem. Temporal isolation is the second thing I hear about. How do I survive denial of service attacks between applications? How do I worry about cache issues? How do I worry about measuring time in an isolated kind of way? We have the answer already for most of that, not all of it, but most of it, and that's MCS. And it's been languishing. We've been talking about MCS since I first looked at this community in 2016, I think. I still don't have a formally verified version of MCS, and to me, between that and multi-core, these are the top 2 things that this community should be talking about all the time and pushing for. And frankly, I ask of this community, if we're not spending all of our attention and time and money on those 2 problems, I worry we have distracted ourselves from what is going to hold seL4 back from success. Now, it has to be inspectable. This sometimes comes off as open source, but it's actually not. Inspectable could be source available. It means that you have to be able to look at the proofs and look at the code and convince yourself this was written correctly. Whether or not you're open to PRs or whatever is a separate issue. Composability, I think seL4 has nailed it better than anything I've ever seen. I love the capabilities-based API. And my last point, performance has to be good enough. Performance, as you measure it in certain ways, is the best I've ever seen. And yet, when I talk to people who are in hot conflicts, when I talk to people who are worried about machines that require multiple cores, they're not using it because it's not performant enough. The good news is we have the answer. Multi-core is, and a multi-kernel solution is there. And I want to see this community really push on it and make sure it gets in and it gets done and it gets brought into the kernel. OS requirements. This is harder because it's more vague. The kernel's easier because you can really kind of boil it down into a couple of issues. As I talk to people out there who are trying to make decisions on what they're going to build on, it's about uptime. That's what I keep hearing. And uptime, and its inverse, which is zero downtime. When I talk to people in defense who are worried about those wars, they can afford zero downtime, which means they have to have maximum uptime. And that comes across two ways. When there's a fault in an application, how fast can you recover and get it running again? And two, when your mission changes, and all you know about it is that it will change, can you apply that change without shutting down your critical system? Almost done. And then you have to worry about multiple stakeholders. You have to worry about regulatory support and isolation, which I already covered. And then you have to have great development tools. And above all, you have to remember that the only thing that matters is the mission. And it's not my mission, and it's not this room's mission. It's the mission of the person who's trying to build a device and deploy it in the field. It's their mission that matters. And their choices are the ones that have to drive the decisions that we make. That's it for me. Throughout the next day, you'll hear from various people on the team. In the back of the room, we have an OS that's up and running. For the first time, you can give them your contact info. We're ready to hand out keys. You can download it. You can play with it. 10 minutes in, you'll have a running system. You'll have applications on it. There's VM support, all kinds of good stuff. Let other people talk about it. Thank you.